In July 2025, something unthinkable happened. Mexico, America's most loyal dairy buyer for decades, shut its doors. Overnight, it suspended all imports of U.S. milk. No warning, no negotiation, no second chances. At first, people assumed it was a logistical glitch. Maybe a border issue, a diplomatic tantrum. But they were wrong. The truth is far more disturbing. Mexico didn't walk away from American milk because of a pricing issue or a supply chain delay. They walked away because they no longer trusted how it was made. And they were not alone. A quiet revolution had been brewing, one that demanded more than cheap goods, one that asked, how was this produced? What was fed to the animals? Can we trace this from farm to shelf? Mexico answered these questions. And their answer was clear: U.S. dairy no longer meets the ethical standard of the modern world. By the end of the year, Canada had stepped in, sealing a $3.2 billion dairy deal that left American farmers stunned and scrambling. This wasn't a trade war, this was a moral verdict. So here's the real question. If a country like Mexico, so historically dependent on U.S. dairy, could turn away without hesitation, what happens when other nations do the same? If you're a consumer, a farmer, or someone whose job depends on the food industry, this isn't just about milk, it's about your future. Stay with me, because the next 15 minutes may explain why America's agricultural empire is falling, and why nobody told you until now. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Mexico in the dairy sector was considered unbreakable. By 2023, nearly 20% of U.S. dairy exports were bound for Mexican shelves, feeding millions and securing stable income for American farmers. The system worked. America produced in mass quantities at low costs, while Mexico relied on the affordability and accessibility of its northern neighbor's supply. But in early 2025, that foundation collapsed almost overnight. Within a few months, U.S. dairy exports to Mexico plummeted by 94%. Shipments were returned, contracts were silently canceled, and once dependable partners stopped answering calls. American farmers, particularly in heartland states like Wisconsin and Iowa, were left with unsold milk, rising storage costs, and a looming fear they hadn't felt in generations irrelevance. The reasons weren't technical. There was no outbreak, no contamination, no diplomatic blow-up. What changed was the world. Mexico had adopted a new standard for food imports, one that prioritized sustainability, traceability, and animal welfare. Inspired by Canada's ethical production model, this shift wasn't about commerce. It was about conscience. The new rules required producers to provide full transparency into their farming practices, how animals were treated, what they were fed, and whether growth hormones or animal byproducts were used. American dairy producers, entrenched in a system built on volume and speed, simply couldn't comply. And Mexico was no longer willing to wait. This sudden rupture sent shockwaves through the U.S. agricultural sector. Farmers found themselves stuck with overflowing milk tanks and no buyers. Small family-run operations that had relied on Mexican contracts for decades began shuttering. Larger industrial farms absorbed losses through subsidies, at least for now. But underneath, the fear was spreading. If Mexico was stepping away, who would be next? Meanwhile, the narrative in Washington was dangerously disconnected. Some politicians blamed Mexico for unfair regulations. Others dismissed the drop as temporary market turbulence. Few acknowledged the real threat, that the global food market was changing and America was no longer the default supplier. The shift wasn't just economic, it was existential. What good is being the world's largest dairy producer if no one wants your product? The United States had spent years perfecting a model of efficiency: feed more, cows produce more milk, flood the market, outcompete everyone on price. But that model was collapsing. Not because it was inefficient, but because it was indifferent. Indifferent to the ethical and environmental values that now mattered more than ever. And at the heart of this unraveling was a painful realization. For the first time in modern history, America's agricultural dominance was being questioned not by force, but by values. While American dairy producers were grappling with collapsing demand and mounting losses, another country quietly stepped into the vacuum: Canada. In the wake of Mexico's dramatic pivot away from U.S. dairy, Canada increased its dairy exports to Mexico by 31%. But this wasn't just a lucky break or a convenient coincidence. It was the result of a system that had been deliberately and thoughtfully built over years, a system rooted in transparency, ethics, and sustainability. Canadian dairy isn't cheaper than American dairy. It's not produced in greater volume. What it is, however, is trusted. Canada's dairy regulations emphasize full traceability from farm to shelf. Every carton of milk can be traced back to the farm it came from. Every cow's diet is documented. Every hormone, antibiotic, or additive is recorded and regulated. And most importantly, Canadian standards prohibit the use of growth hormones and animal byproducts, two of the key concerns that led Mexico to reject American imports. This isn't just regulatory noise, it's a value system. For Mexican officials and consumers, the shift to Canadian dairy wasn't just a trade decision, it was a statement. A declaration that ethics now matter more than economics. Canadian producers didn't have to flood the market with cheap goods. They didn't need subsidies or trade pressure. They simply aligned with a new kind of consumer demand, one that asked, "Can I trust what I'm feeding my family?" And that trust paid off literally. Canada signed a $3.2 billion deal to supply certified traceable dairy to Mexico, filling the gap left by the U.S. withdrawal. In doing so, they didn't just capture market share. They redefined what market leadership looks like. This moment marked a turning point. For the first time, a major global trade decision in agriculture was driven not by price, but by principle. And Canada, a country often seen as a quiet player in global trade, emerged as the unexpected champion of a new food order. While U.S. producers struggled to understand how they lost their most loyal buyer, Canada was already negotiating new deals across Europe and Asia, offering not just milk, but trust in a bottle. The implications were clear. Being the biggest producer no longer meant being the most respected. In the global dairy game of 2025, Canada wasn't just playing to win on volume, they were playing to win on values, and they were winning. Publicly, the loss of Mexico's dairy imports was chalked up to regulatory divergence or economic realignment. But behind closed doors, the reality was far more uncomfortable. This wasn't just a trade shift. It was a referendum on how America produces food, and how long it had gotten away with ignoring change. For years, U.S. dairy farms had operated on a volume-first model. The more you produced, the cheaper your unit cost. That's what the system rewarded. That's what subsidies reinforced. And that's what trade partners once accepted. But this model came at a cost, one that American producers refused to reckon with. To meet massive output quotas, many farms fed their cows growth hormones. Others used animal byproducts to cut feed costs. Environmental compliance was often secondary to speed. And traceability. That was a buzzword, not a requirement. So, when Mexico introduced new standards, ones rooted in animal welfare and sustainability, it wasn't just an obstacle, it was an exposure. Suddenly, the world saw a truth many had ignored. The U.S. was still operating in an outdated system, one that couldn't answer basic ethical questions about its food. And this wasn't the first time. For decades, U.S. agribusiness has lobbied to resist regulation. It has used scale and political power to protect outdated methods while dismissing global shifts toward ethical sourcing as European nonsense or marketing fluff. But that fluff just cost the industry billions. The most damning part, the U.S. didn't lose because it lacked the tools. It lost because it refused to use them. The technology for full supply chain traceability already exists in America. Small producers have been pushing for sustainable certification for years, But systemic change was never prioritized until it was too late. And while farmers paid the price, corporate executives walked away untouched. CEOs of major dairy conglomerates still received record bonuses in 2025. Lobby groups spun the crisis as foreign overreach, and Washington offered little more than platitudes. No strategy, no accountability, just silence. In that vacuum, trust evaporated. For American farmers, the betrayal cuts deep. They weren't just losing markets, they were losing faith in the very institutions meant to protect them. Contracts were canceled without explanation. Supply chains collapsed without backup. And worst of all, no one seemed to have a plan. The truth is hard to swallow. This wasn't an accident. It was a system failure, years in the making. A failure to adapt. A failure to lead. A failure to listen. Now the rest of the world is moving on, building new alliances, signing ethical trade deals, and redefining what food production should be. And America is stuck watching from the sidelines. Beneath the contracts, trade figures, and export charts lies something far more human loss. The collapse of U.S. dairy exports to Mexico didn't just hit balance sheets. It hit families, communities, generations of identity. In places like Wisconsin and Iowa, dairy isn't just an industry, it's a legacy. Farms passed down from grandfather to father to son. Barns built with calloused hands. Cows raised by name. Mornings that start before sunrise and end long after dark. When those contracts with Mexico were canceled, it wasn't just milk that went unsold. It was years of trust, expectation, and stability. Small family-run farms, many already operating on thin margins, couldn't survive the blow. Some went bankrupt within weeks. Others were forced to sell off land, livestock, or equipment just to stay afloat. For many, the emotional toll was heavier than the financial one. I did everything right, one Wisconsin farmer told a local news station. I followed the rules. I worked 7 days a week. And still, I got left behind. There's no bailout for lost pride, no stimulus for broken dreams. And while farmers struggled in silence, the wider American public barely noticed. The news cycle moved on. Politicians made vague promises. But in the dairy heartland, the silence was deafening. This wasn't just a market shift, it was a cultural erosion. Dairy farming has long been woven into the American mythos: honest work, moral integrity, self-reliance. To see that unravel while corporate lobbyists blame foreign interference and offer no solutions felt like betrayal. Worse still, it revealed a chilling truth. The people who produce America's food are often the last to be protected by its systems. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers were celebrated. Interviews with their cooperatives showed pride, unity, and a deep understanding that ethics and economics are no longer enemies, they are partners. Their success wasn't just about compliance, it was about values, and that contrast hurt. The emotional fallout spread beyond farms. Consumers began to question, if Mexico doesn't trust our milk, should we? Supermarket shelves started to reflect this anxiety. Imports labeled ethically produced or Canadian certified gained shelf space. U.S. brands, once synonymous with abundance, became symbols of a system in denial. In truth, the crisis wasn't just economic or ethical, it was existential. It forced a nation to ask, what is the value of food if no one trusts how it's made? And for thousands of American dairy families, the answer came with tears, fear, and a haunting silence in barns that used to be full. By the end of 2025, the verdict was clear. The United States, once the unquestioned powerhouse of global dairy, had lost more than a market. It had lost trust. It had lost relevance. And perhaps, most tragically, it had lost the belief that it could still lead. The collapse of dairy exports to Mexico is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a deeper disease: refusal to change. Across the globe, consumers are demanding more than nutrition. They are demanding transparency, ethics, responsibility. And while countries like Canada, New Zealand, and the Netherlands have risen to meet that call, the U.S. continues to cling to a system that no longer works. Subsidies can't buy back trust. Volume can't replace values. And the longer America waits, the more ground it loses, not just in market share, but in moral leadership. The window for change is closing. The technology is available. The infrastructure is ready. The talent is there. But what's missing is the will, the courage to admit that how we've always done it is no longer good enough. For policymakers, this means rewriting food standards to prioritize sustainability and traceability. For producers, it means shifting from speed to stewardship, from mass output to meaningful quality. And for consumers, it means voting with every dollar, asking the hard questions. Where did this come from? How was it made? Does it reflect the kind of world I want to support? The future of American agriculture doesn't lie in bigger barns or faster cows. It lies in regaining the world's trust. Because if your food system isn't trusted, it isn't competitive. And if it isn't competitive, it isn't sustainable. The clock is ticking. The world is watching. So here's the question, one we can no longer afford to ignore. Will American dairy rise to the challenge and transform itself for a new era? Or will it fade into history as a once great industry that refused to evolve? If you believe we deserve better, not just as producers, but as people subscribe to this channel now, share this video. Let your voice be part of the conversation, because the future of food isn't just about what we eat. It's about what we believe. In 2025, a quiet revolution took place, not on a battlefield, but in grocery stores, trade deals, and border inspections. What looked like a simple supply chain shakeup between the United States and Mexico was in reality something much larger, the collapse of trust in one of the world's most powerful food systems. And from that collapse came powerful lessons not just for farmers or policymakers, but for all of us. The first and perhaps most painful lesson is this: size is no longer protection. For decades, the United States led the world in food production. Its farms were vast, its machinery advanced, its export numbers unmatched. In the dairy industry, this translated into massive output, low prices, and dominance in markets like Mexico. But that model depended on one thing, the assumption that the world would always care more about price than values. In 2025, that assumption shattered. Mexico decided to stop buying American dairy, not because it was expensive, unsafe, or unavailable, but because it did not meet a new set of ethical standards. These standards were not extreme. They were based on traceability, sustainability, and humane treatment of animals. In short, Mexico wanted to know how its milk was made, and the United States could not answer. The result, a 94% drop in exports. Canceled contracts, farms closing. Families losing not just income, but the work that had defined them for generations. The second lesson is this: values now shape markets more than volume does. Consumers around the world, especially younger ones, are asking new questions. Where does my food come from? Was it produced ethically? Can I trust the people who made it? These questions are not just philosophical, they are economic. In Europe, surveys show that more than 2/3 of young people are willing to pay more for food that aligns with their values. In Mexico, it was not a slogan or trend, it was policy. And Canada was ready. Canada's dairy system was built with these values in mind. Farmers there knew their buyers would someday care about how animals were treated, how land was managed, and how products were tracked.